Hi. Today we're going to talk about the history of the DSM. And DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the book that psychologists, psychiatrists, and mental health care professionals use for diagnosis. As you can tell by the title, there are two different parts to the DSM. There's a diagnostic manual. That's the part that sort of helps you to know the symptoms and those kinds of things. And there's also a statistical manual in the DSM, and that lists epidemiological information about the condition, how many people are likely to have it, the course of the condition over time, and things like that. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about the history of the DSM. And here you have a list showing of all the DSMs that have been out. It's kind of hard to see here, but this is DSM 1. That's the first DSM that came out. This is DSM 2, which is a little thin yellow manual. And actually, I have these are my DSMs. DSM 3 came out, and there's a big difference between DSM 3 and DSM 2, and I'll tell you what happened there. DSM-3R, which is a revised edition of the DSM, DSM-4 and DSM-4 text revision, and DSM-5, which is a current version of the DSM. When you know about the history of the DSM and why it was created in the first time, you'll have an understanding of its sort of position in the world of diagnosis, and also some of the frustrations that people have with the DSM. So let's get started. First of all, why bother with a diagnostic manual? There are seemingly different ways to be able to diagnose an individual, but why do we diagnose people to begin with? Well, there are several different reasons. Number one, having a diagnosis will help you to organize the chaos of the individual symptoms that an individual might have. For example, if a person's depressed, they may have a sad mood, lack of energy, problem sleeping, problem with their appetite, but it's not four different things a person has. It's really one thing that's manifesting itself in several different ways. The DSM helps you to organize those symptoms and see how they might be related to a constellation of symptoms. Also, having a diagnosis can really aid in communication. If I have another psychologist that I'm working with and I tell them that someone has OCD, you immediately know the kinds of symptoms that person is likely to have. It's a great way to communicate a lot of information in a very short fashion. It can also be a validation of a client's experience. There are times when I've actually taken out the DSM and shown the diagnosis to a client so they can understand the things that they're going through are related to something that has a name, and that can be really reassuring for clients. It also can help with research, and I'll talk a lot about how researchers use the DSM in just a moment. It can also help practitioners plan treatments and to establish a prognosis, so that if an individual has a disorder, you have an idea about what's likely to happen in the future. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of people are frustrated with the DSM, and many people are, is that it tries to do lots of different things. And there are some people that might say that it tries to do too much. And so one of the reasons the DSM is imperfect is that it serves many different purposes and many different constituencies. And each of these wants something different from the DSM. It's something that I call the Swing Out Sister phenomena. So Swing Out Sister was a band that came out in the 80s, and they really had one big hit that was called Breakout, I think it was called. And Swing Out Sister picked their name because they couldn't find a name that all the groups, people in the group liked. So they picked a name they all hated, which was Swing Out Sister, which is kind of what DSM does. It frustrates everyone. And I'll talk about the different kinds of constituencies that it frustrates. First of all, researchers. So the reason why a lot of psychological researchers use the DSM as a tool to determine the course and effectiveness of treatments. So back when I was in graduate school, one of my jobs was that we were interested in how good primary care physicians are at determining whether or not an individual has a psychological disorder if they come in for something unrelated. So you come in because you broke your arm, or you just a regular checkup, but let's say you're also depressed or have OCD, but you didn't come in for that. How good are primary care physicians at picking up on the psychological disorders? And so my job was to screen individuals and then to go out to their homes and to give them a test, an interview, which is called a SCID. So that stands for Structured Clinical Interview for the DSM, to diagnose them. And I could blow through a SCID in about 30 minutes if I was fast. If it was a more complicated condition, it could take me 3 hours. Because if you're a researcher, you're really interested in a detailed, accurate diagnosis. And you might not even care how long it takes you to get that diagnosis. On the other hand, mental health care practitioners use the DSM as a tool to understand the conditions that their clients have, to apply treatment plans, and for reimbursement. And practitioners, on the other hand, prefer very uncomplicated and user-friendly criteria, because you don't have 3 hours. That's 3 weeks, because you see a person usually for 45 to 50 minutes once a week to get the diagnosis. You want something quick and dirty to be able to give you the diagnosis that you need. So while mental health care practitioners want something easy and uncomplicated, researchers don't care how complicated that is. And so you have this really very different needs that individuals have for the very same manual. The legal system can also be important for criminal responsibility, for custody rights and insurance payments. And the everyday person, the general public, the DSM influences the way that the public views mental illness. Now, our very first attempt for diagnosis was actually in the United States, was way back in 1840. And if you were taking this class in 1840, you had a very simple job. You only had one diagnosis you could choose from. People either had nothing or they had idiocy, insanity. Those are the only diagnosis that you could give back in 1840. Some 40 years later, they expanded to 7 different categories, and a lot of these categories are things that you're probably familiar with even today. So mania, for example, is probably a lot like bipolar disorder. Melancholia, which is probably a lot like depression. Then there's monomania, which is extreme preoccupation, most likely like OCD. Paresis, which is a weakness of voluntary movement. Dementia. Dipsomania, which is a craving for alcohol. I promised myself if I ever opened a bar, I would call it dipsomania. And then epilepsy. So these are the 7 categories we had back in 1880. The great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of the DSM was this book, which was the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane. It was developed by a committee that would eventually become the American Psychiatric Association and the National Commission on Mental Hygiene. You had 22 different disorders in this book. Other diagnostic guides that came out over the years include the Standard Classified Nomenclature of Diseases in 1933. The Office of the Surgeon General had a book with the fascinating title of Medical 203 and was used primarily by the Veterans Administration. And then something really interesting happened. The World Health Organization decided it would be a very good idea to standardize the names of different causes of death. Imagine if a cluster of people dying in one country and a cluster of people dying in a different country that might use different names for the cause of death. And they thought if we standardize the causes of death, it would be really helpful for being able to track, mortality, which was a cause of death. So they came up with this way to do it, and they called this manual the International Classification of Diseases. The first iteration came out in 1851. The 6th edition of the ICD also tracked diseases or morbidity, and it came out in 1949. And this edition included a section on mental health. So you could list for the first time the mental disorders in the ICD-6. Now, in the United States, they decided that they didn't like some of the names or the descriptions of those ICD-6 kinds of conditions. So a committee was tasked to develop a different version of this ICD to be used in the United States, and that was the DSM. So the codes that you see in the DSM are actually ICD codes that are linked to that ICD manual. So DSM came out in 1952, and this is an actual archival photo of the stork bringing the DSM to the United States. And it was a very different manual than we are familiar with today. DSM-1 was an adaptation of Medical 203. It was very psychoanalytic in nature. That's why I've got a picture of Sigmund and Anna Freud here. And not very specific diagnostic criteria, but the disorders were listed briefly and defined. It was mainly used to keep statistical records. DSM-2 came out in 1968. Again, not detailed diagnostic criteria like we have currently. Very psychoanalytic in place, very psychoanalytic in terms of its nature. It was aligned a little bit better with ICD, but again, brief paragraphs for descriptions. People could pretty much diagnose whatever they wanted to. And then something very fascinating occurred. Rosenhan came out with this study. You may have heard of the Rosenhan study before, but you may not realize how much the Rosenhan study influenced psychological diagnosis. So Rosenhan was a psychologist who was very interested in views of mental health and mental illness, and he had a lot of very dedicated graduate students. And what he was able to do was to send Rosenhan himself went, and a bunch of his students also, were to present themselves to psychiatric hospitals complaining of a single condition or complaint. And their complaint was, I'm hearing a voice that says thud. And the reason why they chose this, but that's not really any condition where that would be a symptom. So they were supposed to say that, check themselves into the hospital, and behave normally once they were in the hospital. They all received diagnoses, and apparently the patients in the hospital could easily tell these fake pseudo-patients from real patients, but the doctors could not tell the difference. And Rosenhan's conclusion was this: it is clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. It was a huge embarrassment for the field of mental health. The side story is there's a book that came out not too long ago that suggested that Rosenhan actually didn't send as many people as he said he did, and some of the data may have been fabricated. But despite that, the Rosenhan study had a huge influence on psychological diagnosis, and DSM-3 was the result of that. While DSM-1 and 2 were very sort of general in nature for the diagnosis, DSM-3 was very specific and very different from the other manuals. It came out in 1980, and it was a revolutionary change in the way that we diagnose. And it was really influenced as a reaction from these Rosenhan pseudo-patient studies. The goals included making DSM more consistent with the ICD, and to make the psychological diagnosis more uniform in the wake of that very embarrassing Rosenhan study. They got it done relatively quickly because the researchers swooped in and really changed the DSM. And the reason why they were able to get it done so quickly was that they really implemented a manual that they already had in place, which was called the Research Diagnostic Criteria, which came out in 1979. So a lot of the DSM-3 criteria were really adapted from this RDC criteria, and a lot of the diagnoses were established by consensus. Some of the RCD's goals that they had when they developed the RCD was that psychological disorders should have precise clinical descriptions. There should be laboratory studies that identify biological markers when they were available, a clear way to distinguish one condition from another. And the categories of things that we are describing in the RCD are real things that need to be discovered, and we're not just sort of making stuff up. And they developed a system that was focused on observable phenomena. Remember, DSM 1 and 2 were very psychoanalytic and based upon sort of non-observable things like id, ego, superego sort of stuff. What they wanted was something that's more sort of behavioral in nature, which is what the DSM 3 and on were focused on. Brand new features of the DSM 3 included a multi-axis system, which we've since abandoned, decision trees, field trials, so that to test the diagnosis, a focus on culture and gender features that might be distinct, the prevalence of conditions, how many people might have a certain disorder at any given time, the course of conditions, which is how conditions may change over time, any family patterns, and a way to differentiate one disorder from another. Some people thought that DSM-3 was kind of a rush job. DSM-3R came out in 1987. DSM-3R was a revised edition, and some categories were changed and added, reorganized, renamed. They did a new section for disorders that need to be studied later, and created a way that you could just figure out which disorders should be diagnosed if there were two incompatible ones. And this is what are called hierarchical rules. DSM-4 came out in 1994. That non-axial system was introduced that we're using currently. And one of the big complaints about DSM-3 and 3R was that everything sounded like it could be a psychological disorder. And in DSM-4, you could only diagnose a thing as a psychological disorder if the symptoms produce a clinically significant distress in the individual or impairment in their social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And you'll see this in every diagnosis in the DSM, this importance of distress and or impairment. So there are some disorders, for example, that cause a lot of distress but not much impairment. Other disorders that cause less of impairment, but people who have the conditions aren't distressed by it. And many of the conditions contain both distress and impairment. DSM-4 text revision came out in 2000. That TR stands for text revision. And what they updated in DSM-4 TR was really the statistical manual. The diagnostic manual remained pretty much exactly the same. You'll see here that it looks like back in DSM-1, there was a great increase in the number of diagnoses, reaching almost 300 in DSM-4 and DSM-4 TR. Remember, it's the same book, except for the statistical manual is different. And it looks like we lost a lot in DSM-5. We didn't. DSM-5 includes lots of specifiers for conditions, which are different versions of a disorder. And there are probably more disorders than there are in DSM-4 and previously. It also looks like we are, leveled out in the number of pages. We didn't. They divided a lot of the things into several different manuals in DSM-5. So there's about half a dozen different books or so that you can get. In fact, one of the criticisms from the American Psychiatric Association Press was that they make a lot of money from DSM. So in the next video, we're going to talk a lot about the DSM itself, the way it is structured and how it's a little bit different. And then I'm going to make a separate video to show you how to access DSM-5 through Psychiatry Online.